Welcome to the Wounded Masculine. If you're interested in learning about the mechanics of masculinity and the unfortunate and often dysfunctional ways that it can develop, you're in the right place. This is going to be a two-part series where we take a deep look at masculinity in order to understand the depth of wounding that men can experience throughout their lifetimes. I'm going to be teasing apart both causes and effects, so you can better understand yourself, and if you're a woman watching this, you can better understand the men in your life. In part 2 of this series, I'm going to be going on into the psychology of healing and exploring the various approaches that are necessary for men who are interested in personal growth and development or building healthy relationships. So make sure you stick around for part 2 to get the complete perspective of what I'll be sharing here. In this episode, however, I want to lay some of the groundwork so we can really start to understand why men are so wounded, as well as the various outcomes that creates in the world and in relationships. My name's Jasper Brown, and welcome to The Conscious Masculine. Over the last 10 years, I've really started to step into personal growth and development in a sort of full-time sense. I really started my journey wanting to understand, first and foremost, myself, as well as wanting to understand women, sex, and relationships. And I think this is a common experience for men who step into personal growth and especially men's work. It's through a certain absence or a certain lack or struggle in this area of our lives. Now, I always thought of myself as being the good guy. And yet, at the same time, found myself causing tremendous harm in my relationships and really struggling in this part of my life. After a certain amount of negative experiences, this created a certain form of cognitive dissonance within me. On the one hand, I had this vision of myself and the man that I was. And on the other side, I had my results or the facts of how I was actually showing up in the world and the kind of relationship experiences that I was living out. And there was a certain rift or, disconnect between those two things, who I thought of myself and how I was actually being in the world. And this forced me at a certain point to admit certain truths about myself and take a hard look in the mirror. After all, if your relationships and the experiences that you're making in this area of your life are dysfunctional repeatedly over time, it probably says something about you, because not all of your partners, not all of the people out there are the ones who are messed up. Eventually, we need to look in the mirror and start to connect some dots and look to ourselves and figure out what we could be doing better. So for me, this started a slow, laborious, lengthy process of somehow starting to connect the dots and see the patterns from my past, which were really influencing the way I was showing up in the present. And I had to admit to myself that I didn't fully understand why that was or what was happening. These patterns were really undermining my desires and aspirations to have healthy and balanced relationships in my life. So slowly I started to connect certain dots and see how certain events in my childhood and my younger years had negatively impacted me. There were many things that happened to me in my younger years that I didn't know how to deal with at the time. Things with my parents, my sister, things with other children, and of course my early relationships that I stumbled through and somehow made the best that I could with what I had at the time, but that at the same time left a lot to be desired. The more that I studied and understood these things, the more I started to really make sense of developmental psychology And this really started me on the path of healing, putting myself back together and fixing or stitching back together the wounds that were caused in my younger years. And though I'm still working through many of the deep layers and patterns that certain events created in me throughout my life, I have made a tremendous amount of progress. So in this episode, I really want to help illuminate some of the common struggles that men face as they grow, how this translates into particular dynamics in relationships, and really how this gets a lot of us stuck. Because I think so many men need to hear this, and so many women will benefit from understanding these things and bringing a fresh lens, a fresh perspective, and a more nuanced, insightful approach towards the difficulties that we face in relationships. If you're new to this topic, I really encourage you to keep an open mind, because this perspective really changed my life, and I've seen it time and time again work wonders for the men that I work with. And if you're familiar with this topic already, I really encourage you to stick around, because I'm going to be sharing some deep insights on this topic, as well as personal stories from my life. And I'm sure that's going to be very, very useful for you. So let's start off with prefacing everything by an understanding and definition of what wounding is. Psychological wounding really refers to the emotional and mental pain that results from difficult experiences, trauma, and societal expectations and pressures. This can include obvious things like childhood abuse, neglect, bullying, intense stress that we experience from trying to meet expectations, as well as a whole host of complications that we face in relationships. It also includes much more subtle influences from our relationships with our caregivers when we were still very young, and even environmental conditions or the experiences that our parents were going through when we were still in the womb. This can also have a big impact on us. These wounds often show up in us and get expressed as anger, depression, anxiety, trouble forming close relationships, or turning towards unhealthy coping mechanisms like addiction to porn, drugs, video games, social media, etc., etc. And I'm sure by now some of this is already sounding familiar, right? Chances are, as I go through this list, you'll notice patterns or things that relate specifically to you. Now, I really want you to pay close attention to those, because what jumps out at you is very significant. And I want you to try to bookmark that, because we're going to come back, we're going to reference those things in the future, and we're going to keep pulling at these threads as we go deeper and deeper into this topic. And towards the end, I'm going to set some homework for you, which is really going to help you to clarify and put this theory into a very useful form of practice that will generate some significant results and insights from your personal situations. So let's dive a bit deeper into the sources of wounding to understand where all this stuff comes from and what happens. Many things can wound us, and to understand this properly, we need to explore our development at its most vulnerable stage, which is the beginning. As a baby, we are basically at the mercy of our environment, as well as the beings around us at that time. We're also basically a complete sponge of ignorance, kind of soaking up everything around us, highly influenced and susceptible to the environment that we're in, trying to make sense of what we are and what reality is and start the process of growth and identification with ourselves and with the environment and with form. So in a certain way, it stands to reason that what transpires at this very critical stage of life will mark us in tremendously deep ways. That's literally like the first imprints that we get from life after we're born. We're also pretty much completely unaware of what happened at that time. Our earliest memories are typically forgotten, right? If I think back into my history, I have patchy kind of splotches of images or feelings or memories from my early years. But so much of that, the majority in fact, is simply deleted or lost, buried deep within our memory or our subconscious mind. Even if you think you had a good birth or a pleasant childhood, you have to admit that you don't really know, do you? Judging by the amount of stuff that we've forgotten, all manner of things could have occurred or gone wrong during pregnancy with our parents, during childbirth at the hospital, and in our first years of life, we have pretty much zero clue, apart from the testimony of our caregivers, our parents, perhaps what they've shared with us. And yet so often there can be a tremendous source of insecurity during this time of our life because we are so vulnerable, so exposed, so unconscious and helpless. And these experiences can inadvertently shape many of our core beliefs about the world, about relationships, about people. And in general, as an extension of that, the next place we really need to look is our parenting. The quality and consciousness of your parents and the way that they performed that duty and responsibility is huge. Cannot be understated. Most parents in our generations were, let's say, not particularly trauma informed. That's only a fairly recent development within our society. Most of us grew up with parents that were doing their best with the tools that they had, as is often the case. But despite their best intentions to be good parents, there is inadvertently many, many things which they missed. Things which could have wounded you as a child, experiences that you made, situations that occur, you needing them, but them not being able to attend to you. You struggling or crying or requiring a certain form of reassurance and attunement and safety, but perhaps they were just busy or burned out from being a parent and overwhelmed emotionally by this incredible burden of having this completely defenseless, completely dependent baby organism to take care of. The sleepless nights, the constant feeding, nurturing, the outbursts of emotion, completely unfiltered, crying, screaming. Not to mention their, complete devotion and love for you. Their fear of something going wrong in those early stages of hurting you, wounding you, missing something terrible happening to you. So there's all these complex array of things and experiences that happen at that time. The parents that we have were definitely trying to be the best parents that they could, and yet so many things that a child needs in those moments are missed or not addressed. And as we learn more and more and more about the nature of trauma, our consciousness is evolving and our skills as parents is definitely improving. But we have to acknowledge that there is a huge gap between the needs of a child and what the parents are able to offer. And it's not always 100% attended to in the perfect way. There's always gaps. This can be a tremendous source of wounding as a child. Another area or another factor that we can have as children in relationship to our parents is when we have kind of parents that were fairly strict or authoritarian. Boys who get raised in an authoritarian household may learn to suppress their emotions and conform to rigid standards of behavior, leading to a lack of emotional expression and empathy. We might have had absent or distant father figures in our life. The absence of a father figure or an emotionally distant father figure can leave boys without a positive male role model in their life, which can foster feelings of abandonment and insecurity. We might have had overbearing or emotionally neglectful mothers, creating a damaged or warped relationship to the feminine. We might have had patterns of enmeshment, somehow our identity being fused with our mother, and this creates a certain specific pattern of wounding, which we love to typically refer to as the mama's boy. We also may have had dysfunctional parents in which the child grows up needing to caretake or soothe or placate their parents who are dealing with emotional or mental issues in their life or just very difficult life circumstances. They may need to adopt the role of taking care of their parents or taking care of the other siblings that they have in their life who are Boys also often grow up with dysfunctional parents in which they end up needing to caretake, soothe, and placate their parental figures if their parents are going through difficult life circumstances, toxic or challenging relationships, or addictive patterns in their life. Sometimes we need to adopt the role of parent for other children, our siblings, who are being neglected by our parents because our parents are consumed by their own struggles and don't have the time and energy needed to properly take care of their kids. This can take and form certain patterns of wounding. This can teach us as children to withhold our emotions and our feelings because basically our parents couldn't handle it at the time. And that creates a specific pattern of wounding. We might have experienced divorce and breakup as children, which can be a deeply traumatizing experience because as children, obviously, we're very receptive to our parents and the state of their nervous system. If they're constantly stressed, anxious, worried, going through conflict, this is going to impact us, especially in those younger years when we're really like a sponge trying to make sense of the world. Going through breakups is very stressful. There's a lot of conflict involved. There's moving houses, moving schools, changing friendship or social circles. And as a child, this can be deeply unstabilizing or destabilizing. from my own perspective, my parents divorced when I was about 9, 10 years old. And I think we moved house several times. I think in my life, at a certain point, I counted, we had 11 houses over the years. And I went to a bunch of different schools. And of course, at the time, I justified it to myself when I would convince myself that I was fine. I got 2 birthday presents, 2 Christmases, and I got to, change houses, and I made the best of that somehow. But it definitely had an effect on me during those very formative years, and it was difficult. It was especially difficult seeing my parents, 2 people who loved each other, become bitter enemies and fight over us as children. I think that left some very deep wounds inside of me. A lot of people argue and raise the question, but I had a great childhood. I can't complain. My parents loved me. I'm grateful for how good it was. Other people have it much worse. And yet, underneath that, there can be so many things. I used to say that. Compared to many other people around the world, my upbringing, my childhood was glorious compared to kids in Africa or so many in other parts of the world. And yet there were still many things that were missed. There were still many unconscious patterns that developed inside of me, many things that I was left wanting and missing and needing and didn't receive. In general, this expresses in so many ways as a lack of emotional support. Because us boys grow up so often without adequate emotional support and validation. And therefore, we often struggle to really understand and express our true feelings, which results in a certain form of emotional numbness, an avoidance of emotion, and a difficulty forming deeper connections. And this was definitely the case with me. It took me a long time to really understand and pull this apart, because on the surface, I am fairly extroverted, find it very easy to form connections with people, friendly, outgoing, confident in myself. And yet there were layers, deep layers of conditioning which prevented me from actually being truly authentic, expressing what I really thought and felt, connecting with people in a more deep, intimate, emotional sense, and forming deeper bonds. You have to remember that as a child, you don't understand why your parents behave the way that they do. I didn't understand why my parents were divorcing, why our family was pulled apart. So many times we get left by ourselves to deal with our emotions and the problems that we're facing alone. To cry in a room. We get put in a room by ourselves. We're too much for our parents to deal with, and they just push us away, or they isolate us, or they punish us, which we don't fully understand when we're at that age. And obviously those instances when we don't fully understand the context of what's happening or the motivations for what our parents are doing, this triggers a very deep instinctual fear inside of us. The fear of abandonment, the feeling of rejection. And as a child, abandonment and rejection is tantamount to death. Because our primary caregiver, the person that we look to for all guidance and support, who is literally holding our life in their hands, is abandoning us, or seemingly abandoning us, punishing us, rejecting us, pushing us away, telling us to shut up, be quiet, smacking us potentially, which leaves us as children questioning, grasping for answers, not understanding, not connecting the dots. We have so much room in situations like that for us to question if we're even lovable, if we're good enough, if we even deserve to be alive. Which is painful, so painful. Most of the time we lock all of those memories away. And going through my own path, I remember hearing at certain stages my parents telling me different things about my childhood, when they broke up. I remember specifically when my mother told me, this was much later in life, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, that when they broke up, remember I was 9, 10 years old, I went into my room and I locked myself in my room for 3 days crying. And I went into this dark place. I went into this hole. I had completely forgotten about this. And when she told me that, it cracked me open, and I just burst into tears and wept. Because all that stored emotion, that blocked, stuck shadow of pain and misunderstanding and heartbreak of a 9-year-old boy finding out that his family is disintegrating, burst forth. And this has happened many, many times on this path as I've moved through these things and understood more and more and more. Little bits unlock one thing at a time. And I'm sure you have situations or circumstances or events in your life that are waiting to emerge once you become more aware and once you give them space. It's very often we have these kind of repressed memories in the form of wounding that happens during our childhood. Boys also often grow up with parents who punish sensitivity, vulnerability. And when boys are punished for or shamed for showing vulnerability and expressing their emotions, they may learn to associate this kind of behavior with weakness, leading to fear of vulnerability and consistent patterns of emotional suppression. Sound familiar? As boys, we often hear these phrases like toughen up, don't be a pussy, be a man, which really teaches us from a young age as boys to reject certain parts of ourselves. I've talked a lot about this in the episode I did about nice guy syndrome, about these patterns of wounding that cause us to develop certain coping mechanisms of suppressing our emotional authenticity in order to be accepted and loved by those around us. And really in my life, I avoided expressing my sensitive feelings for my entire history because I was afraid that revealing that sensitive stuff about me would make me even weaker than I already felt. And I've talked to so many men over the years who echoed this sentiment. We're somehow in this difficult position because on the one hand, we feel this tremendous sensitivity. And there we have a very vulnerable side of us. But we're very much conditioned not to show it, not to reveal it, that it's not attractive, that it's not socially acceptable. Men are supposed to be tough, stoic, alpha. And that creates a schism. That creates a cognitive dissonance between the reality and what we project to the world. And that is a tremendous source of wounding. The next category that I want to talk about is abuse and violence. Physical abuse in particular. Experiences of physical abuse can instill fear and aggression in us as boys. We may learn to use violence as a means of protecting ourselves and controlling our environment or other people. Many men that I've known were on the receiving end of abuse from family members or even lovers. I myself have been on the receiving end of abuse at various stages in my life. And this is often diminished, unfortunately, by society, and especially women, because men are supposed to just be able to take it. There's a form of certain collective guilt because men are part of the patriarchy. Men are supposed to just suck it up. Women have had it much worse than men from the violence and abuse point of view, and especially the sexual abuse point of view, that men's pain is insignificant. Now, it's very true that women have certainly experienced a lot of this, and it's not, the whole point is that it's not one or the other, it's both. And so long as we diminish anyone's pain, we are missing the opportunities to actually get to the source of that pain and bring healing to it. Sexual abuse can often cause profound emotional and psychological damage, obviously, which leads to issues that men have with trust, with intimacy, and with our sense of self-esteem, our self-worth. Also, commonly as well, unfortunately, a lot of men feel ridiculed or ashamed, too embarrassed to even admit that they've experienced any form of sexual abuse. And yet it is also remarkably common. I've experienced events like this in my life, and it's really taken me decades and a lot of work to be able to summon the courage to actually even talk about it. And how do we heal something if we can't even talk about it? If we're too ashamed or too guilty or too afraid to even open up about the past, how do we even begin engaging with it, processing it, understanding it, or seeking help? And there's so much stigma that limits men in this direction that so often it goes unaddressed, unexpressed, and remains a shadow throughout our lives. We also have various forms of emotional abuse, which is much more subtle, often completely unacknowledged. Even as a form of abuse, it's rarely acknowledged. But it is nonetheless very, very damaging. Emotional abuse tends to have deeply psychological implications for men's self-esteem, their confidence, their relationship with themselves. And of course, a warped relationship with yourself extends into your relationships with others. It's important to acknowledge that emotional abuse is a thing. It happens. It's common. It needs to be talked about. It needs to be addressed. It needs to be worked through. And we as men collectively have a tendency to accept it without challenging it, without pointing it out, without labeling it, without taking a stand against it. It's especially common in relationships with women, where a woman will be upset, she will be wounded, she will be unleashing her pain. And that can very easily snowball into emotionally abusive forms of conflict, which have a very damaging psychological impact on us as men, especially if that's sustained over long periods of time or throughout long-term relationships. And that can be very, very damaging. We might have had emotionally abusive relationships with our parents, and that can be tremendously damaging for us men. The next category is war and violence in general. Exposure to violence, whether it's in a domestic setting, in your neighborhood, perhaps you were sent off to do military service in the country that you grew up in. This can often result in things like PTSD, hypervigilance, somehow always being expecting, prepared for violence that might just be around the corner. And this leads to a certain numbness, an emotional detachment in men, which is a dangerous thing. Because men who are emotionally detached or numb are much less attuned, much less sensitive, and much less safe to be around, because they're not connected to that part of themselves. So many people around the world are exposed to tremendous violence, subjected to all kinds of experiences related to war. And this can have a tremendous and damaging effect. So many of us experience bullying throughout our lifetimes, especially in our childhood. Being bullied leads to a deep-seated feeling of inadequacy in us as men, shame, repressed anger, which manifests as aggression or hypercompetitiveness later in life. It's important to notice that with each pattern of wounding, there is an associated coping mechanism. Certain things like being bullied when you were younger might result in you pursuing a specific type of career or job. It might result in the way that you approach sports or competition. Another interesting insight from my life is that whenever I compete, whether it's in jiu-jitsu or playing a game of chess, I feel a dysregulation of my nervous system. I'm not cool, calm, and collected. It activates me. There is a fierce, like when I was playing chess with my father, I'd be like hot under the collar, desperate to win. And I have very vivid memories of being bullied in school. I remember viscerally being terrified of my tormentors. As I moved to school many, many times, I was exposed to many different groups of young boys, and as the new kid, you get picked on. And here's the funny thing. Later in life, I've actually had men come up to me in my 20s and tell me that they were bullied by me and that they resented me for it. And the thing is, I forgot. I didn't even remember the events or the situations that they were talking about. One guy was saying something like he remembers me kicking him when he was down or something like this, and I wouldn't let him get up. I don't remember. So it's very interesting to notice the way that your memory will suppress certain experiences that you had in the past, which relate to your wounding. And as you start to do this work, things will start to bubble up. You will have things return, memories return, images appear in your mind, feelings emerge in your body. That's why it's so necessary that we do this work of developing emotional intelligence so we can actually start to identify and work with what's there. If you haven't listened to my episode on developing emotional intelligence, highly recommend doing that. Just as an example of how things can bubble up, this is the kind of skills we need to develop will enable us to make space for that stuff and deal with particular situations or people or events or things that we become aware of, just like I did when this man came up and told me about me bullying him, which also doesn't fit with my self-image. I didn't see myself as a bully. I was not a villain. I much prefer to think of myself as the victim. But it's an important step for us to make, is acknowledging that we can also be perpetrators. We can also be responsible for causing tremendous harm. And it was in fact my being bullied that put me in a position to then take on the role as the bully. Very important to notice that pattern playing out in your life. And I've seen that pattern playing out in relationships. Me being emotionally manipulated or abused, and then passing that on as a tendency. So it's really important we start connecting these dots and seeing these patterns emerging within us, because this is really going to help us to elevate our understanding. The next category is peer pressure. So often we have a certain form of pressure to conform to group norms and behavior, which forces us as boys to adopt toxic traits, such as dominance, bullying, emotional suppression, and behaving in a way that basically allows us and facilitates us fitting in and being accepted. You have to acknowledge that that is a powerful motivating factor that can push us in a direction, and very often in unhealthy directions. Look at what happened in Nazi Germany. Peer pressure pushed people slowly towards committing terrible atrocities. Ideology, groupthink, dogma, this can be very powerful influences to cause and also perpetuate patterns of wounding. And I think every man on the planet can relate to this concept in various ways playing out in his life. We also have dysfunctional and toxic relationships as a topic, as an area of wounding. Wounded people in relationships tend to wound one another. Feminine trauma gets unleashed onto men very commonly. The previous episode that I've done is on women's anger and understanding their pain and the rage that is being expressed through the feminine. It's definitely worth checking that out. I've had some great feedback on that episode. I even had a woman express to me that she broke down in tears because she felt so seen in that. We as men also unleash our pain onto women. There's a lot of repressed anger and frustration and resentment building up in men. And especially this kind of battle of the sexes, this dynamic between men and women, is a highly polarized and charged area of our lives where there's a lot of us versus them, me versus you, victim, villain stories and narratives playing out. And so many of us behave in very, very unskillful ways, which creates a lot of wounding. This brings up the topic of attachment wounds. We have anxious and avoidant attachment styles and their associated coping mechanisms. So often we attract relationships with someone on the opposite end of that spectrum. We have an anxious attached person with a more avoidant attached person. And this is called a deathly dynamic, where we have these very dysfunctional battles between getting our need for attachment and also expressing our need for safety and being individuals. Also a very, very common area of wounding, where we see the patterns that we developed in childhood really start to play out in the relationships that we have in the present. And until we don't become aware of these kind of dynamics, these will play out largely unconsciously, and we will keep wounding each other again and again and again, and we enter these very toxic dynamics, also known as a trauma bond, when your trauma hooks into the other person's trauma, and that keeps you in this vicious cycle, gaslighting each other, love bombing each other, blocking each other out and stonewalling, labeling each other as narcissists. It's a tragically common experience, especially when we're growing up, we're having our first experiences of relationships, we're bumbling and stumbling our way through, especially when we're carrying wounds from our childhood. Obviously, that starts to play out in the relationship sphere, and then we have a certain set of negative experiences that get reinforced and built over time, layered and layered again with more and more experiences. And I've certainly been guilty of that and experienced that in my relationships. And really, that was the catalyst for me to really start looking into this stuff, as I expressed in the beginning, was that my failures, my fuck-ups, my continuous struggle and angst and turmoil to actually function in close proximity with women forced me to wake up and acknowledge that I had stuff to look at. Because I've been both a victim and on the receiving end of tremendous abuse and violence, and I've also been a villain. I've also behaved in deeply unskillful ways. I've done things which cause tremendous harm, and I'm also guilty. And really, at the end of the day, it takes two to tango. It's never good enough just to blame the other person. We also need to look at ourselves. Now, not everyone is equally guilty or equally unskillful or equally wounded, but we all have our parts to play in the relationship environments that we create. And if we keep attracting wounded and dysfunctional and abusive or toxic people into our life, we need to look in the mirror, because there's something in us that is attracting that is calling that in, that is resonating with those wounded behaviors in others and accepting them. So we need to become aware of that. Otherwise, we're going to keep looping in dysfunctional, toxic relationship cycles. We also have a wide array of societal pressures and cultural expectations which can influence us and wound us in various ways as men. We have certain traditional gender roles that are still active within society, somehow being dragged from the past into the present. There's a certain societal expectation that men should be strong, stoic, a dominant force in relationships, and that reinforces this idea that emotional expression is a sign of weakness, and that can be very damaging. This traditional gender norms and the way that conditions us really prevents men from developing healthy emotional habits and healthy coping mechanisms for dealing with intense emotions. We're much more likely to suppress it, become avoidant, numb ourselves out, than to face and deal with those problems in a more emotionally aware and intelligent way. And we see a lot of that still playing out in society. We as boys experience a lot of that in our father figures. And of course, that gets passed down from generation to generation. It definitely changing within our lifetime. Things have transitioned a lot. But those currents definitely still exist. There's also a very large emphasis on success impressed upon us by our society. The financial status, our levels of achievement in career and our ambition, which really sort of drives us as men to prioritize work and external validation over emotional health and relationships, which can lead us to developing things like workaholism and becoming burnt out as we fry our nervous systems with this ceaseless urge to perform. That can be a very damaging and wounded dynamic. As well as this very unhealthy fixation on the approval of others, this external validation, this certain superficiality that we see with men needing to accumulate vast sums of wealth, Lamborghinis, and maintain a harem of women. Where does that come from? My argument would be that that is a result of various intersections between a complex array of wounded patterns that force men to seek their sense of self-worth in external objects, material wealth, or this kind of socially validating achievements. And generally in the media, we see this somehow glorified. This hyper-masculine traits of like aggression, stoicism, sexual conquest, at the same time ridiculing or ignoring traits like empathy and vulnerability and emotional awareness. These representations that are all too common in our media really shape boys' perceptions of what it means to be a man in a negative way. If you look online, it doesn't take much searching to stumble across the vast echo chambers of toxic masculine ideals that are still being perpetuated in our media, which is basically pressuring men to conform to these very harmful behaviors and attitudes, which really discourage them from seeking help or showing vulnerability or admitting that they have weaknesses, or even being open to listening to women, to bring an attitude of empathetic understanding, curiosity, compassion. And of course, this is personified by figures like Andrew Tate, the Tate brothers in general, where we have these hyper-masculine, caricaturized men with insanely large social followings, influencing the minds and psyches of young men with this traditional masculinity virtue somehow wrapped up in wolf's clothing, parading as alpha, the pinnacle of masculinity. This could be a whole episode in and of itself, just talking about the Tate phenomenon and the negative impact this has on men and how we think of masculinity in the world today. Perhaps I'll do that at some stage. But in general, we can look at this whole alpha beta narrative that men seem to get locked up in and caught in as being deeply unhealthy, where it's men somehow shaming other men, creating these very unrealistic ideals of masculinity, of how a man should be, what a real man looks like, what a simp looks like, and denigrating, ridiculing, shaming other men for being less than the ideal. I think this is a deeply unhealthy dynamic and narrative that gets perpetuated online. And I very often have men jumping into my comment section, calling me a pussy, calling me a simp, say that I'm basically a beta male because I'm talking about these kind of topics. Because I'm interested in women's experiences, because I'm calling out men and their shitty behavior. And I'm saying we can do better than this. I get shit for that, you know? So that's interesting. And it's also, if we look at it through this lens of wounding, we can see where a lot of that narrative comes from. If as boys we're exposed to this vast laundry list of influences that I've just talked about that lead to masculine wounding, it's only making sense that so many of the men in the world are expressing themselves and somehow acknowledging or living out those coping mechanisms and their wounds. And there is nowhere that we see that more prevalently illuminated than online. Because online, obviously, everyone is a keyboard warrior. We get to hide behind this filter, this shield of anonymity, essentially. And with the sort of possibility and the avenue for just unleashing. We can say whatever we want. We can have no filter. There's no recourse. You know, you would never express those things towards a woman's face. You would never say those kind of things towards another man to his face, or very rarely, you know, you're likely to get punched, or someone's going to take you to court, or you're going to get publicly humiliated and shamed by your social circle. So in terms of understanding the wounding that men experience, we see that playing out all the time. Constantly in our society, in our culture, in this whole super polarized online space, we can see people's wounding is a huge influence, and it's largely responsible for all of the unconscious, unskillful, vitriolic, harmful behavior that we see. It's super important to acknowledge here that I'm not necessarily even demonizing this. We need to acknowledge that all of these wounded patterns are a result of a lack of safety. All of these patterns emerged from times and situations in our life as men where we were not attuned to, we did not get our needs met, we did not feel safe with the other people around us or with the outside world. And those wounds are constantly acting out through us. Most often these patterns started developing in childhood, from our earliest years, on top of which are layered years and decades of experiences that are then used to reinforce the beliefs that we hold around people and the world. We then internalize those beliefs, they become subconscious, and they limit us in many, many ways. We start thinking things like women can't be trusted, emotions make you weak, Lamborghinis and bitches will make me happy. I'm not good enough the way that I am. I have to please other people in order to be loved. And it's these kind of subconscious beliefs that are buried deep within our mind. And as I've talked about, so many of the situations or environmental conditions or social things that happen to us as we grew up get deleted from our memory. And yet they reside somewhere deep inside of us. And then they play out in an unconscious way because we haven't done this work, we don't understand, we haven't become more conscious yet, and we haven't brought those shadows out into the light, so to speak. And the nature of our ego is always going to justify what we do. We're always going to have reasons. We're always going to have a logical argument because that's the nature of self-bias. We lie to ourselves all the time in order to maintain the appearance of who we are or who we think we are. Because when you are the main character of the universe, it's pretty hard to think of yourself as the bad guy, right? We always, from our perspective, we always have good intentions. There's always a logic and reason behind what we do. And that is exactly the mechanic that makes understanding our wounds and our patterns and the deeper underlying issues behind certain behavior that we adopt so difficult, so tricky to access, so sneaky and deceptive. Because we're literally battling our own psychology. Our own mind is actively trying to trick us and deceive us so we can maintain a certain form of social appearance or a social image or a self-image as the good guy, even while we're causing tremendous harm. You know, and as I look at my life, I see that it was this complex combination of many different influences that turned me into the man that I am today. I had self-esteem issues, nice guy syndrome, emotional avoidant tendencies, a selfish desire to get my needs met, my needs for validation and approval. And I would find covert, subtle ways to get those needs met. But once I started to admit to myself that I'm capable of very unskillful, selfish, and hurtful behavior, and I started to take that difficult look in the mirror, that's when I made huge shifts. That's when things really started to change. And now that I've become more aware and more conscious of myself and started connecting the dots, that awareness alone is very curative. Because as we become aware of things, as we pull things out of the subconscious mind into the conscious mind, we make it an object. We make it something we can objectify. We make it something that we can witness. And then it stops having so much power over us. In fact, it was just the other day that I had a small example of this appear. My partner, she sometimes jokingly, teasingly, playfully teases me about my height, because I'm a short king, only 5'10" here. And the more that she did that, eventually it started getting to me. And I confronted her about it. I got upset and I accused her of planting that in my mind because throughout my life, it had never been a thing. I didn't feel like I had a sensitivity towards that because I'm just average height. I'm not unusually short. I'm not a real hobbit or a dwarf. And yet her words landed in me in a way that caused me to be triggered. And so I accused her. I was like, you planted this in my head. It wasn't an issue until now, but you've turned it into an insecurity inside of me. And she's going, "Oh, yeah, sure." Yesterday, I found out as I was at my father's house looking at the wall where we used to measure our heights as we were growing up, that my sister was taller than me for a couple of years. She's younger than me. And my mother said at the time, she's like, you used to get so upset because your sister was taller than you. And you were obsessed about measuring yourself, trying to catch up to her. And then, of course, my partner goes, ha! I didn't plant that in your mind. That was your insecurity. Now it makes so much more sense. So I was able to connect that dot. And this is, again, another example of the way that our mind will suppress information, bury information, hide our wounding, and yet it has a very real implication in the present. I was getting hot under the collar. I was getting a bee in my bonnet. I was getting upset because she was calling me short. And there was a very real, tangible reason in my history why I was sensitive to that kind of criticism. Because for years and years and years, I was ashamed and embarrassed by my height. Interesting, no? Just a little micro example there, but I think it's kind of illuminative and constructive to see things like that and point to myself so you guys can have some examples to examine. And that brings me to the homework that I want to set for you guys this week. Grab out a pen and paper or journal about these questions or sit in meditation and contemplate these. Ask yourself, what happened in my childhood that could have wounded me? What did I make those experiences mean? How do I relate to the opposite sex, and what beliefs and assumptions do I hold about them? Am I holding any grudges? What patterns of wounding can I observe throughout my relationships and my life? This is really worth sitting down with, contemplating deeply, and starting to paint the picture, starting to fill in the gaps. When you have insights in this area, when you connect those dots, talk about them. Ask the people around you. Ask your partner, ask your parents, have this conversation with them, because when this stuff starts to connect, your character traits and how you show up in relationships in the present will make more sense. This has real world implications. This is not just something, fun facts. This is deeply fundamental psychological building blocks of who you are. And we want to get to the root of that. We want to fill in those gaps. We want to build a very stable foundation on which your further levels of growth and development can be built. I can't stress enough how important this is. In the next episode, in part 2 of this series, we're going to be taking a comprehensive look at the path of healing that men need to go through in order to start addressing these wounds. We've talked a lot today about what causes us to be wounded and how that might look. Next week, we're going to do a deep dive into the process of healing. I hope you've enjoyed this episode. Please follow the podcast or subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're on there. And I would love to hear what you thought about this episode in the comments. If you're interested in taking this work deeper, you can join the Conscious Masculine community and course. I'm actually going to be opening that up in the next week. I'm going to be launching that. There's a ton of content inside. We have weekly group meetings as a group of men who are invested in this work and committed to bettering ourselves. So if you find that sort of thing interesting and you feel called to join us, you can check out the link to that in the description. And lastly, I want to leave you with a final perspective and insight. This whole notion of wounding is super important. A wound that is unhealed continues to bleed. And as it bleeds, it sucks your energy. You are depleting yourself if you leave your wounds unaddressed. And if we leave our wounds unaddressed, our whole life will be ruled and consumed by the pain and dysfunctional coping mechanisms that we're in. Without doing the work of healing, our psyche, our psychology remains fractured and broken in many different ways. And it's very, very hard to be truly happy when you're struggling. It's difficult to develop deep, intimate relationships when you're fundamentally broken. And it's almost impossible to raise your level of consciousness when you are suffering and stuck in your wounds. At the highest level, we can see that healing is essentially the art of bringing love and awareness to pain. And in next week's episode, we're going to be exploring exactly how to do just that.